The village was quiet in the hours before dawn. A soft mist clung to the thatched rooftops, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from the previous night's hearths. In the center of the settlement stood a timber-framed cottage, its shutters closed, its small garden bordered by a low wattle fence. This was the home of Agnes Weaver, the herbalist, a woman whose craft was as old as the hedgerows themselves. Agnes's work, like that of herbalists across medieval Europe, was both respected and quietly questioned. She was not a physician. Those were men trained in universities, quoting Galen and Hippocrates in Latin, but she knew plants with a familiarity that felt almost like kinship. She could name every stem in the fields, every root along the brook, every leaf that curled toward the morning sun. In the medieval world, the role of an herbalist sat somewhere between healer, gardener, and keeper of forgotten things. People would come with aching joints, fevers that lingered, or wounds that refused to close. Some would come for advice about sleep, for the restless heart, or for protection against bad airs, the miasmas thought to carry illness. In her kitchen, bundles of drying herbs hung from the beams: rosemary for memory, sage for strength, yarrow for the blood, lavender for calm. Their scents mingled in the cool air, a living pharmacy swaying gently in the draught from the chimney. But Agnes's pride was not just in the herbs she grew and gathered. It was in her parchment garden, not a patch of soil, but a collection of vellum-bound pages, each holding the life of a plant in careful ink and pigment. She drew each leaf as she saw it, painted with colors made from crushed minerals and plant dyes, then wrote in her own steady script the Latin name, the common name, and what she knew it could do. This practice, the illustrated herbal, was part of a tradition stretching back centuries. Medieval herbalists copied knowledge from older works, some from ancient Rome, others from the Arab world, where physicians had preserved and expanded Greek medical writings during Europe's darker centuries. Books like De Materia Medica by Dioscorides, written in the 1st century, still formed the backbone of plant medicine in Agnes's time. But hers was not a scholar's library copy. It was a living record of her own fields, her own remedies, and her own mistakes. The parchment itself was costly. True parchment was made from animal skin, usually sheep, goat, or calf, soaked, scraped, and stretched until it was smooth and pale. Vellum, the finest variety, often came from calfskin, prized for its even texture. In Agnes's village, parchment makers worked near the river, where they could wash hides and keep the smell away from the homes. It was a craft as precise as any physician's art. Too much scraping and the page tore. Too little and the surface wouldn't hold ink. Because parchment was so dear, Agnes used every scrap carefully. She sometimes practiced her sketches on wax tablets first, flat boards coated in beeswax, which could be smoothed over and reused. Only when she was certain would she commit a drawing to parchment, dipping her quill into ink made from oak galls and iron salts, its deep brown lines drying to a near-black sheen. Her garden in ink had its own seasons. Spring brought the early greens: chickweed, nettle, primrose. Summer swelled with chamomile, mint, comfrey. Autumn offered roots: burdock, valerian, angelica. Even winter had its entries: dried berries, the bark of willow trees, resin from firs. This was not idle decoration. In a time when literacy was rare among villagers, her illustrated herbal was both a teaching tool and a safeguard. If a child brought her a plant and asked its use, she could show the page, point to the colors of the petals, the shape of the leaves, and explain its gifts and dangers. Medieval Europe's relationship with herbs was practical and spiritual at once. Some plants were used in remedies. Others were worn for protection. Marigolds were said to guard against enchantment. Rue was planted to keep out serpents. On Midsummer's Eve, villagers might weave garlands of St. John's wort to ward off evil spirits. Agnes wrote these beliefs alongside the medical uses, not because she always believed them, but because they were part of the plant's life in the village mind. Herbs were more than medicine. They flavored food in an age before refrigeration, preserved meats in brine and vinegar, dyed cloth in hues from yellow to deep green. Woad, a plant with dull green leaves, yielded a brilliant blue pigment when fermented, a color worn proudly on the tunics of soldiers and the banners of lords. But perhaps the most soothing part of Agnes's work, the part that belonged in the quiet hours before the world stirred, was the act of turning a page. Running her hand along the margin, feeling the faint texture of the skin beneath the ink, she would remember where she had gathered each plant, who had first told her of its use, and the season when she had drawn it. The parchment garden could not wilt. It could not be stolen by goats, drowned by floods, or lost to frost. It was the village's memory, pressed between two boards of oak and bound with leather softened by years of touch. Outside her door, the mist began to lift. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a rooster called. Agnes closed her book for the moment, slipping it into a chest. The day's work would soon begin, the gathering, the cutting, the slow, deliberate drying. But for now, the house remained wrapped in the last threads of night, the air still scented with rosemary and sage, the silence deep enough to hold the heartbeat of history. Knowledge, in Agnes's time, did not travel quickly. There were no printing presses yet, not in her early years. Every book was copied by hand, every page the work of hours, sometimes days. And yet, somehow, plant lore moved across borders and overseas, carried by people whose footsteps left no mark in the written record. Some of it came through traders. A peddler might bring cinnamon or pepper from distant ports, telling stories of lands where the air itself smelled of spice. Along with these goods came seeds, sometimes by accident, clinging to cloth or tucked in with the wares. Other knowledge arrived with pilgrims. On their way to holy shrines, they would stop in villages, sharing what they had seen growing in other climates. But the greatest guardians of plant knowledge in medieval Europe were the monasteries. Behind their high walls, monks kept gardens not just for beauty or for food, but for medicine. The monastic herb garden, the hortus medicus, was often divided into neat beds, each devoted to a different class of plant: aromatics, vegetables, simples for healing. Monks recorded their findings in herbal manuscripts, often copying and translating older works. One such work was the Leech Book of Bald, an old English medical text from centuries before Agnes's birth. Another was the Tequinum Sanitatis, a medieval handbook of health based on an 11th century Arabic text by Ibn Batlan. These books combined medical uses with advice about diet, exercise, and even the best seasons to gather certain plants. Agnes herself had once been allowed to see the garden of a nearby priory. She remembered the smell most of all, a mingling of thyme, fennel, mint, and rose that seemed to hover in the warm air. The beds were edged with narrow wooden boards, the soil dark and fine from careful tending. Every plant had its place, its label written in neat Latin letters on small wooden tablets. The monks, like village herbalists, believed in the doctrine of signatures, the idea that God had given each plant a sign of its purpose. A plant with heart-shaped leaves might be good for the heart, one with yellow sap might treat jaundice. Today, science does not support such reasoning, but in the medieval mind, it was a way to make sense of the natural world. Agnes did not entirely believe in signatures. She had seen enough to know that the likeness of a plant did not always tell its truth. Still, she recorded such beliefs in her parchment garden because they were part of the heritage, and because her neighbors found comfort in them. Her own living garden, unlike the priory's, was less orderly. The wattle fence kept out goats, but inside, plants mingled as they pleased. Calendula nodded beside mint. Valerian's tall stalks shaded young sage. In one corner, near the kitchen wall, a patch of lemon balm grew so thickly that bees visited from first light to dusk. Tending such a garden was quiet work, and it happened in rhythms that matched the turning of the year. In spring, the soil was loosened and enriched with compost from the midden heap. Early shoots were thinned so each could grow strong. This was when Agnes gathered nettles, tender before they grew too coarse, and primrose blossoms for calming teas. Summer was the busiest season, cutting sprigs of rosemary before the blooms faded, harvesting chamomile just as the petals began to curl back, pulling mint in the cool of morning so its oils would be strongest. She hung the bunches upside down in her loft, the air filling with their mingled perfume. Autumn brought the digging of roots. Burdock came up in long, stubborn taproots, its earthy smell clinging to the hands. Valerian roots were scrubbed and sliced for drying, a scent some found unpleasant but others swore soothed the mind. Winter was for working indoors. This was when Agnes copied her notes into the parchment garden, sharpening quills, boiling gallnuts to make fresh ink. The crackle of the fire and the slow scratch of pen on skin made a music of their own. The knowledge in her book was not hers alone. Many of her remedies had been passed down from her mother, who had learned them from hers. Others came from neighbors, from traveling sellers, from the occasional scrap of a manuscript bought or bartered. One recipe, for a salve to ease joint pain, had come from a shepherd who swore he'd learned it in Normandy. It used comfrey root and goose fat, wrapped in linen and warmed by the hearth before being applied. Another, for soothing coughs, came from an elderly woman who had once worked in a manor kitchen. It combined honey, thyme, and vinegar, taken by the spoonful. These remedies did not always work as hoped, and Agnes knew it. She was careful to warn people that some ailments needed more than herbs, though in her village, physicians were rare and costly. Still she did what she could, and perhaps as much as the plants themselves, it was her calm voice and the sense of being cared for that brought relief. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, Agnes sometimes read her notes aloud to herself. It was not vanity. It was the pleasure of hearing the words take shape in the air, as if the plants themselves might listen. She wrote in plain language, not for scholars but for neighbors. Chamomile for easing rest, she might note. Gather in summer. Dry the heads in shade. Steep in hot water. Cover the cup so the steam stays. Her book was becoming heavy now. More than 40 plants recorded in detail, with space for more. The leather binding creaked when she opened it, and the pages smelled faintly of the lime water used in curing the skins. Someday, she thought, she might not be able to tend the garden herself. But the parchment garden would remain. A child might leaf through it and remember the scent of rosemary in the air, the sound of bees among the lemon balm, the cool shadow of valerian on a summer's day. Outside, the world was changing. Rumors came of a new invention in distant Mainz, a press that could make books in hours rather than months. Agnes could not picture such a thing, but she wondered, if plant knowledge could be shared so quickly, would it be cherished less? Would the careful turning of pages, the long memory of hands and eyes, be lost? For now, though, the ink still dried slowly on each new page, and the garden outside still grew by the patient light of sun and moon. And Agnes, in her small cottage, still kept watch over both, the living leaves and the leaves of parchment, bound together in time.